One of the striking things, as you said, about the story of Deborah and Jael is you have two female protagonists, and you've got to admire their femininity. But Jael.
Hammer and peg through the head of an enemy?
Well,
Is that the part you mean?
And first of all, her hospitality, taking in the poor man, giving him milk, and then when they gets him asleep, hammer a tent peg. Now, should we hold this up as a biblical value?
My daughter's middle name is Yael. That's true.
And I hope it empowers her.
I hope so. I don't know if she knows the story well enough. But, I mean, yes, it's a fascinating story, precisely because even when women are in positions of leadership, people like Miriam, or prophets, people like Huldah later on, or matriarchs, rarely are they assuming the roles that typically are occupied by men in the story. But here we have Deborah, who is a prophet and a judge, and who they seemingly are not willing to go to war without.
Yeah.
And we have Yael, who is the one who lands the death blow.
Yeah.
To end the fighting. This is a sort of an astonishing thing. What do you make of the existence of this?
They do then suggest, Joe, that this is especially humiliating.
Sure.
For Sisera, that he was killed by a woman. But at the same time, you have anything can happen. In other words, this may be a patriarchal book, but it's not so patriarchal that you can't have exceptions.
Yeah, it's an interesting situation where the patriarchy underlies the humiliation of being killed by a woman, and at the same time has a woman doing the killing in an empowering sort of way.
It isn't exactly proto-feminist.
No.
And it has nothing really to do with the liberation of normal women or any perceived need of liberation even. But it allows for the fact that the spirit can descend on a woman as well as on a man.
Absolutely. Every little girl can read the story and hope to grow up someday and drive a tent peg through the enemy's head if they're lucky enough to be.
Which is very important to bear in mind before we get to Jephthah's daughter in a little bit.
We will keep that in mind.
We'll get back to that.
To my mind, one of the interesting things about the judges, about the story of Deborah and Yael, is that we get it in two back-to-back versions.
Yeah.
You get a prose version of it in chapter 4, and then you get a poetic version of it in chapter 5. They are largely the same. They're not identical. I don't think there's so much conflict that we have to sort of put them against each other. But clearly you've got two versions of the same thing going on. The song in chapter 5 is often considered to be potentially one of the oldest pieces of text in the entirety of the Bible.
Yes, we both studied at Harvard with Frank Moore-Cross to some degree, and that this was part, I suppose, of the Albrightian legacy, that the ipsissima verba of Yahweh, as Noel Friedman famously said, or what you get when you reconstruct the original poetry.
That's too far. It's too far. Okay. But I think what we've been saying in the fact that the poem seems to refer to tribes that didn't make it,
right?
And refer to the way that tribes ally with each other. And I think that's such an interesting aspect of the poem in particular. Is the Deborah calls on people to come join the battle, calls on tribes, and then she says nice things about the ones who come, and she says bad things about the ones who refuse, and that feels old.
Oh yeah,
it feels old. It feels pre-monarchic, which makes it 11th century kind of material.
Halperin had a very interesting book, The First Historians, in which he argued that the people who wrote the prose account here, and also the prose account in Exodus 14, which stands in a similar relationship to a poem in Exodus 15, that they were trying to write history, trying to infer or reconstruct what happened on the basis of poetic accounts.
Yeah, there's an interesting, I remember when I was at Harvard and I was learning from Jim Kugel, and one of the things that he pointed out is that in the, Hebrew poetry works in this sort of parallelism where you say the same thing twice. And the line about Yael killing Sisera in the poem has her, reaching her hand for a tent peg or some sort of instrument. And then it says, and her right hand for another kind of blunt instrument. In normal poetic conventions, that doesn't mean she reached for one thing and then another. It's just saying the same thing twice. She reached for, so in the poem, I think, she smashes his head in. When the prose account comes to turn the poem into prose, which is, I think, what happens, now she's got one thing in one hand and one thing in another, and now she's doing this. Yes. So, I mean, I think that's this is this interaction of texts, of older texts and of later attempts to, as you say, historicize them and bring them into line with other conventions.
Now, also another old feature of the Song of Deborah is it gives you a picture, what brought those tribes together. Mm-hmm. And actually, when you look at it here, in the days of Shamgar, son of Anath, in the days of Jael, caravans ceased, travelers kept to the byways. The peasantry prospered in Israel, they grew fat on plunder. So, what have you got here? You have got tribes living up in the hills. Now, caravans bringing goods to sell between the major powers. Mm-hmm. And they raid them. Mm-hmm. It's highway robbery, is what they were engaged in. And then the kings of Canaan evidently tried to put a stop to this, and they assembled, and you get this big battle. And that's why people are asked to come to the aid of the Lord. Now, you come to the aid of the Lord by coming to the aid of your own people. Mm-hmm. The Lord, in this case, is the patron of plunder. It's whatever is good for the tribes, that's Yahweh's.
The patron of the survival of Israel.
Yeah.
And especially in this time, and I say in this time, both in the story world, which is, Israel has just sort of is newly settled in this country, and there are these major powers around it, and in sort of historical time, if we want to talk about it, when Israel is just settling in the highlands and is surrounded by people more powerful than it. This is, plunder is a way of surviving. It won't be forever, but again, the story really does a good job of capturing the sort of social and political situation. And what brings the tribes together, and this is the theme that runs throughout Judges and will lead us directly into Samuel, is external threat is a terrific way of getting people who are otherwise independent to cooperate. And those of us in America know this perfectly well. This is how, independent states decide to join up and form a union. So it's an interesting picture of folks who seem to be going it on their own for the most part.
Yes, indeed. As we'll see when we get to the end of Judges, in those days there was no king in Israel. But now, for a lot of the book of Judges, there's also some resistance to the idea of there being a king. Mm-hmm. So you have the story of Abimelech, who gives it a shot. And he puts the case to the people of Shechem, wouldn't it be better for you to have one rather than 70 sons of whoever?
And you notice how small he starts, right? King of Shechem, right? Like,
he's
not talking about being king of all Israel. But they're coming out of a situation in which what they're used to is not big nation states, but city states.
Yeah.
The Philistines, the Phoenicians, the Canaanites were all city states. The idea of, so even as they're starting to talk about, like, do we want kings? We shouldn't be thinking like great Assyrian imperial style or Egyptian imperial style kingship. That's not even what's on the table, even when they're having these early debates about whether kingship is good.
Right. And the fact that you're talking about essentially the king of a village in some cases doesn't mean he's not a king.
Right.
That's what a king was in many cases.
And again, thinking ahead to Saul in the book of Samuel, Saul is also largely king of a village. He occasionally, and this Judges is like this too, a local ruler or hero who can muster up other folks from around and about to come help him fight a battle. After the battle's over, their dealings are done. But for that moment, that guy is as kingly as Israel had.
Yeah. Now, one of my favorite passages here in Judges, I think, is Jotham's fable. Mm-hmm. And very often when I was teaching the first half of Old Testament introduction, we'd get to this point around the time of the election. And so I thought it was a nice text to reflect on. That the trees went out to anoint a king over themselves, and they said to the olive tree, reign over us, and the olive tree answered them, shall I stop producing my rich oil, by which gods and mortals are honoured, and go sway over the trees? And the same with the fig tree. And they said to the vine, and the vine said, no, why should I give up making my nice wine to rule over the trees? And the one they get to do it is the bramble.
Yeah.
That's, I suppose, a fairly cynical view of political power, but mind you, not without its justification.
Yeah, there's a lot of conflict within the Hebrew Bible about whether monarchy is, whether limited or extended, is a good thing or a bad thing. And Judges is struggling with this, even in stories about judges before we get to, as you said, at the end of the book where it really comes to the fore. Yeah. What do you think this is an ongoing discussion in Israel, or is the fact that we're looking at people saying, I don't know about monarchy, is that an older substratum?
Now, I guess my gut feeling is that yes, there was an element of this. It makes sense to me in the context of Judges. If tribes living up in the mountains, generally speaking, are going to be suspicious of any kind of centralized authority. Now, in Judges, it surely then this gets picked up and glorified in a way after the collapse of the monarchy, and this is the hard thing to decide. You know, how much of this is just a reaction? Because there are long stretches later on when kingship is great.
Sure.
You know, the king is the anointed of the Lord. What more can you want? But then, after the collapse of the two kingdoms, there's nothing good to be said about it.
Right.
So
when you read Judges, I think one of the ironies is it constantly shows people who act in relatively kingly ways. So-and-so was in charge of all Israel, right, which we just said is probably not the case. Yeah. But still, we've got this notion of all of Israel being brought together under a centralized leader who rescues them from, you know, all of the bad things and rules Israel in peace for 40 years or whatever it is.
Yeah.
At the same time that they're saying, we really don't like that stuff, though. And I think that's what we have when we've got like the expansion of these local legends into broader national.
But, you know, I think if there was a collection of these stories of Judges, and there may well have been, before the Deuteronomist got his hands on it, then, you know, this would have been stories about the good old days. Mm-hmm. Now, I think a lot of the point of it would have been, wasn't it great when we didn't have a king? But a bit like stories about the Wild West. You know, in the good old days when a guy could go out and shoot up the town, or then, you know, when the Gary Cooper character could come in and save everybody.
Yeah, the man in the white hat.
Yeah.
Sure. Yeah, it's Judges is a time both of, this is the beginning of disobedience, really. After Joshua and the obedience and the conquest. And suddenly there's constant disobedience, but it's the disobedience that allows for the rise of these hero figures. You know, Joshua, for all his success, is a little boring. Yeah, I think.
Yeah.
But these stories, again, whether it's Samson, which is so obviously a great story, or Ehud, or Deborah, these are terrific stories, and I think that's part of what makes this a really compelling book.